Okay, well, of course, it isn't really Solomon. The book called The Wisdom of Solomon is the only one of the wisdom books that was actually written in Greek. And Solomon sure as hell didn't write anything in Greek. This is a book that was written around the time of Christ. Probably, I would guess, about a decade later than Christ, but right about that time. And before I get started on it, I should tell you something about Hellenistic Judaism, because in the Hellenistic age, which is to say after the conquest of Alexander, so you're beginning a little before 300 BCE, when Alexander went to Egypt, founded Alexandria, and then a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Judeans migrated to Egypt, as indeed did many other of the small peoples in the region. This was the new opening, the new opportunity. Now, Alexandria then became a great hub of Hellenistic civilization in that part of the world. And the Jewish community prospered in Alexandria. They got in well with the Ptolemies. A lot of them were mercenaries. They were very supportive of the Ptolemies, and they had a flourishing culture. It's hard for me to avoid comparing it to 19th century Germany. That this was, a Jewish community that it didn't lose its own identity, but it did assimilate to a degree. They wanted to perceive themselves as being both Greek and Jewish, and they did not see a contradiction between those. They translated their Bible into Greek, called the Septuagint, and then they produced a vast literature. A literature about as extensive as the Bible in what has come down to us, although a lot of it is fragmentary. And most of that literature was very positive about Greek culture. As somebody said, what was Plato, but Moses speaking Greek. So the assumption was that Plato and Moses were essentially saying the same thing. Now, you may say that's a bit of a stretch, but this was, a positive hermeneutic. It was a positive attempt to translate one culture into another. And they were doing just fine until the Romans came in. The Romans conquered Egypt in 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra. And after that, things went downhill a bit for the Jewish community because the Jews tended to support the Romans. They opened the gates of Alexandria to Julius Caesar, and this was resented by the Alexandrians. And then the Jews were perceived as a foreign body, and as the privileges of the Greeks in Alexandria were cut back, they resented the Jews all the more. And in 38 of the Common Era, there was what we might well call a pogrom in Alexandria, an attack on the Jewish community. And a lot of it, as I say, was this resentment on the assumption that Jews were somehow being favored by the Roman Empire. I should mention in this context that one of the prominent people in the Jewish community at the time was a man named Philo, who was a philosopher, arguably the only significant Jewish philosopher in antiquity. And Philo's mission in life was to translate the Bible into Greek, to interpret it in terms of Greek philosophy. And the way he did that was by allegorical interpretation, which was very respectable at the time, which meant that, Moses didn't really mean what he said. He meant something symbolic. So, and you get this in other Jewish writings of the time too, that if Moses forbids eating certain types of food, say shellfish, or certain types of birds, this isn't because of superstition. This is because they have some symbolic significance. So there was a great effort to both maintain a distinct Jewish identity and at the same time try to make it seem respectable to the Greeks. Now, this is the world out of which the wisdom of Solomon comes. My guess is that this was composed around the time of that pogrom, or a little after that pogrom in Alexandria, because you do find evidence in it of tensions between Greeks and Jews, which you don't find in the earlier literature. Philo, the philosopher, was actually part of a delegation sent to Rome to plead the case of the Jewish community with the Emperor Caligula, and that didn't really go so well. But you know, this was the kind of spirit of the time. Now, the wisdom of Solomon and Philo did not, for that reason, give up on the idea of believing that the Jews were actually the best form of Greek civilization. You know, that the Jewish religion was the highest form of Greek philosophy. Now, needless to say, not too many people who weren't Jews actually believed that. But that was the interpretation. And as I say, it reminds me an awful lot of what went on in Germany in the 19th century. And indeed, unfortunately, the outcome was a bit similar too. Because 100 years after Philo, that community was wiped out. Now, that was due to circumstances largely beyond their control. Some of it was spillover from the revolts in Judea, and then a lot of people from Judea migrated to Alexandria. But, you know, they fell out with the Romans, which was not a safe thing to do at that point in time.